Welcome to Sleep History, where the most shocking betrayals and tragic turns of fate come alive to guide you into peaceful rest. Tonight's journey takes us to the year 1204, when the Fourth Crusade committed what many consider the greatest act of treachery in medieval history. This extended sleep story explores how an army of Christian knights, sworn to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, instead turned their weapons against Constantinople, the most magnificent Christian city in the world, from the noble intentions of Pope Innocent III to the devastating sack that would cripple the Byzantine Empire forever. Discover how greed, politics, and broken promises transformed a holy war into history's most profitable betrayal. Close your eyes. Let the gentle crackle of our medieval brazier transport you to the golden walls of Constantinople and drift into dreams of silk banners, marble churches, and the tragic collision between East and West that changed the course of Christianity forever. Sweet dreams await in the shadow of one of history's greatest moral catastrophes. They called it a crusade, but it became the largest robbery in medieval history. Venetian merchants, ambitious nobles, and landless knights transformed a holy war into a business venture that would reshape the medieval world. The target wasn't the Muslim enemies of Christianity. It was the richest Christian city on earth, packed with gold, silk, and treasures beyond imagination. Tonight, discover how sacred duty gave way to naked greed in the shadows of Hagia Sophia. The Fourth Crusade began with the most noble of intentions, proclaimed in 1198 by Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and ambitious pontiffs in medieval history. Innocent was barely 37 years old when he ascended to the papal throne, but he possessed a vision of Christian unity that stretched from the frozen fjords of Norway to the burning sands of Palestine. To him, the liberation of Jerusalem from Muslim control was not merely a political objective, but a sacred duty that would unite all of Christendom under papal authority. The Pope's call for a new crusade came at a moment when the Christian hold on the Holy Land was more precarious than it had been since the First Crusade captured Jerusalem over a century earlier. Saladin's stunning victory over the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 had reduced the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem to a handful of coastal cities, while the Third Crusade's failure to recapture the Holy City had left Christian morale at its lowest ebb in generations. But Innocent III's vision extended far beyond the simple recapture of Jerusalem. He dreamed of healing the schism between the Eastern and Western churches that had divided Christianity since 1054, bringing the Byzantine Empire under papal authority while simultaneously liberating the Holy Land. It was an ambitious plan that required enormous military and financial resources, as well as a level of international cooperation that had never been achieved in previous crusades. The Pope's initial strategy was to avoid the mistakes that had plagued earlier crusading efforts. Instead of relying on royal leadership that might subordinate religious objectives to political gain, he would organize the expedition through preaching campaigns directed at the nobility and merchant classes of Western Europe. Instead of the overland route through the hostile territories of the Byzantine Empire and Anatolia, the new crusade would travel by sea, avoiding the logistical nightmares that had destroyed so many previous expeditions. The response to Innocent's preaching was immediate and enthusiastic. Throughout France, the heartland of crusading tradition, nobles rushed to take the cross and pledge themselves to the liberation of Jerusalem. Count Theobald of Champagne, one of the most powerful and wealthy magnates in France, assumed leadership of the expedition, bringing with him a network of family connections and feudal obligations that promised to make the Fourth Crusade the largest and best organized expedition since the First Crusade. But beneath the surface of religious enthusiasm, more complex motivations were already shaping the character of the expedition. Many of the knights who took crusading vows were younger sons of noble families, men whose birth order had denied them substantial inheritances and whose only hope of acquiring land and wealth lay in military adventure. For them, the crusade represented not just a religious duty, but an economic opportunity that might transform their social and financial status permanently. Similarly, the merchant communities of northern Italy and southern France saw the crusade as a chance to expand their trading networks into the lucrative markets of the eastern Mediterranean. The Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, had grown wealthy through commerce with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, and they understood that military control over key territories could translate into commercial dominance that would benefit their cities for generations. The most significant early development in the organization of the Fourth Crusade was the death of Count Theobald in 1201, before the expedition had even departed from Western Europe. His replacement as nominal leader was Boniface of Montferrat, a choice that would prove to have profound consequences for the ultimate direction of the crusade. Boniface brought to his new position not only military experience and aristocratic connections, but also a complex web of political relationships with the Byzantine Empire that would later influence crucial decisions about the expedition's objectives. Boniface's family had extensive connections with the Byzantine imperial court, including marriage alliances and commercial partnerships that gave him detailed knowledge of the empire's internal politics and military weaknesses. More importantly, his brother Conrad had briefly ruled as King of Jerusalem before being assassinated in 1192, giving Boniface both a personal stake in the Crusade's success and intimate familiarity with the political complexities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The crusading army that assembled in France during 1201 was impressive by any medieval standard, numbering perhaps 35,000 men, including knights, sergeants, infantry, and the essential support personnel required for a major military expedition. But feeding, equipping, and transporting such a force across the Mediterranean would require logistical capabilities that far exceeded anything the Crusaders could organize independently. They needed partners with the ships, supplies, and maritime expertise that only the Italian commercial cities could provide. The negotiations that followed between the crusading leadership and potential Italian allies would ultimately determine the fate of the expedition, though none of the participants understood the full implications of the agreements they were making. The Crusaders approached several Italian cities, including Genoa and Pisa, but it was Venice that offered the most attractive terms for transporting the expedition to the Holy Land. Venice in 1201 was at the peak of its medieval power and prosperity, a maritime republic whose merchant fleets dominated trade routes throughout the Mediterranean, and whose political influence extended from the Atlantic coasts of Europe to the trading posts of the Black Sea. Under the leadership of Doge Enrico Dandolo, Venice had transformed itself from a provincial Byzantine dependency into an independent power that rivaled the greatest kingdoms of Europe in wealth and military capability. Dandolo himself was an extraordinary figure who embodied both the commercial acumen and political ruthlessness that had made Venice great. Approaching 90 years of age and nearly blind, he nevertheless possessed a mental acuity and strategic vision that made him one of the most formidable political leaders of his generation. His long life had encompassed the rise of Venice as a great power, and he understood better than any of his contemporaries how military campaigns could be shaped to serve commercial interests. The agreement negotiated between the Crusaders and Venice in 1201 appeared straightforward on its surface. Venice would provide ships, supplies, and transportation for the entire crusading army in exchange for a payment of 85,000 silver marks, an enormous sum that represented several years' income for most European kingdoms. Additionally, Venice would contribute 50 war galleys to the expedition at its own expense, making the Republic an active partner in the crusade, rather than merely a transportation contractor. But the treaty contained provisions that would later prove crucial to the expedition's ultimate direction. The Crusaders agreed to assemble at Venice by June 1202, with the final payment due before the fleet departed for the Holy Land. If they failed to meet these financial obligations, the Venetians would be released from their commitments and free to pursue alternative arrangements. More significantly, the treaty established Venice as an equal partner in any territorial conquest achieved by the Crusade, giving the Republic a direct financial stake in the expedition's military success. The winter of 1201 to 1202 was spent in frantic preparation as the crusading leadership attempted to raise the enormous sums required by their agreement with Venice. Lands were sold, treasures were pawned, and loans were negotiated throughout Western Europe as nobles liquidated their assets to fund their participation in the expedition. But despite these efforts, it became clear that the Crusaders would be unable to meet their financial obligations to Venice without some form of alternative arrangement. The situation was further complicated by a significant shortfall in recruitment. Many of the knights and nobles who had initially pledged to join the expedition chose alternative routes to the Holy Land, either travelling overland through Hungary or arranging independent passage with other Italian cities. By the time the army assembled at Venice in the summer of 1202, it numbered only about 12,000 men, rather than the 35,000 for whom transportation had been arranged. This reduction in the size of the expedition created a financial crisis that threatened to destroy the crusade before it had even departed from Europe. The Crusaders found themselves obligated to pay for ships and supplies calculated for nearly 3 times their actual numbers, while their reduced force meant that they had correspondingly fewer resources available to meet their commitments. The stage was being set for the compromises and alternative arrangements that would ultimately divert the Fourth Crusade from its original objectives. Doge Dandolo, faced with a crusading army that could not pay for the services it had contracted, proposed a solution that appeared to benefit all parties while secretly advancing Venetian commercial and political interests. The Crusaders could work off their debt by assisting Venice in military operations against the city's commercial rivals and political enemies, after which the expedition would proceed to the Holy Land as originally planned. The first target proposed for this arrangement was the Dalmatian city of Zara, a former Venetian possession that had recently transferred its allegiance to the Kingdom of Hungary. Recapturing Zara would eliminate a commercial rival, demonstrate Venetian military power, and provide the Crusaders with an opportunity to gain military experience while working toward their ultimate objectives in the Holy Land. The proposal was controversial from the beginning, as it required the Crusaders to attack a Christian city whose inhabitants were fellow Catholics, rather than the Muslim enemies they had sworn to fight. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade any such diversion, threatening to excommunicate any Crusaders who participated in attacks on Christian territories. But the crusading leadership, faced with the choice between abandoning their expedition entirely or accepting Venetian terms, chose to proceed with the attack on Zara, despite papal opposition. The siege of Zara in November 1202 was a military success, but a moral catastrophe that foreshadowed the later betrayal of Constantinople. The city fell after a brief siege, its walls were demolished, and its population was subjected to the kind of systematic looting that would later characterize the sack of the Byzantine capital. More importantly, the expedition had demonstrated that crusading vows could be subordinated to political and economic considerations when circumstances made such compromises appear necessary. The success at Zara also established the pattern of decision-making that would govern the remainder of the expedition. Venetian influence over the Crusade's direction had been demonstrated and accepted, while the crusading leadership had shown its willingness to compromise religious principles when faced with practical necessities. The stage was set for even greater betrayals as the expedition moved deeper into the treacherous waters of Mediterranean politics. As the crusading army wintered in Zara during the early months of 1203, new opportunities and temptations began to present themselves that would ultimately divert the expedition entirely from its original religious objectives. The most significant of these was the arrival of Alexios Angelos, a claimant to the Byzantine imperial throne, who would offer the Crusaders rewards beyond their wildest dreams in exchange for their assistance in his personal political ambitions. The transformation of the Fourth Crusade from a religious expedition into a commercial venture was nearly complete, though few of the participants yet understood how far they had strayed from their original sacred mission. The young man who arrived at the Crusader camp outside Zara in the winter of 1203 carried himself with the dignity of imperial birth, but his eyes held the desperate gleam of an exile who saw his last chance slipping away. Alexios Angelos was barely 20 years old, yet he had already experienced the full brutality of Byzantine court politics. His father, Emperor Isaac II Angelos, had been overthrown and blinded by his own brother Alexios III in 1125, while young Alexios himself had spent years as a prisoner in the imperial palace before managing a daring escape to the west. Now, standing before the assembled leaders of the Fourth Crusade, Prince Alexios offered them a bargain that seemed too generous to believe. In exchange for their assistance in restoring him to his rightful throne in Constantinople, he promised to provide 200,000 silver marks to fund their expedition to the Holy Land, more than twice the amount they owed to Venice. Additionally, he would supply 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to join their army, provisions for a full year, and most tempting of all, he would heal the schism between the Eastern and Western churches by bringing the Byzantine Empire under papal authority. The offer was staggering in its scope and seemingly impossible to refuse. Here was a solution to all the expedition's financial problems, plus military assistance that would make their ultimate success in the Holy Land virtually guaranteed. The young prince spoke with the confidence of someone who understood the vast wealth of the Byzantine Empire and the loyalty it could command when properly led. To the debt-ridden Crusaders, struggling to justify their attack on Christian Zara to an increasingly hostile pope, Alexios's promises seemed like divine providence offering them a path back to their original sacred mission. But the offer also represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of their expedition. Instead of proceeding directly to the Holy Land to fight Muslim enemies, they would first become involved in the complex and treacherous world of Byzantine politics, supporting one claimant against another in a civil war that had nothing to do with their crusading vows. The decision they made would determine not only the fate of their own expedition, but the future of the Byzantine Empire and the entire balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Doge Dandolo was among the first to recognize the extraordinary opportunity that Prince Alexios's proposal represented, though his motivations were rather different from those of the crusading nobles. Venice had extensive commercial interests throughout the Byzantine Empire, including valuable trading privileges that had been curtailed by recent imperial policies. A grateful emperor, Alexios IV, would presumably restore these privileges and perhaps grant even more favorable terms for Venetian merchants operating in Byzantine territories. More significantly, Dandolo understood that a weak and dependent Byzantine emperor would be far more advantageous to Venetian interests than the traditional pattern of strong imperial leadership that had often opposed Venetian expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean. If the Crusaders could install Alexios IV on the throne, Venice would gain a client ruler whose power depended on Western support, fundamentally altering the balance of power in one of the world's most important commercial regions. The crusading nobles had their own reasons for finding Prince Alexios's offer attractive. Many were younger sons, or lesser nobles, whose participation in the expedition represented their only hope of acquiring the wealth and land necessary to establish themselves as significant political figures in their home territories. The prince's promise of vast financial rewards, combined with the prospect of conquering new territories in the wealthy Eastern Empire, offered opportunities for advancement that far exceeded anything they might achieve in the relatively impoverished Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Moreover, the proposal appeared to provide religious justification for what might otherwise seem like a purely mercenary endeavor. By healing the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, they would be performing a service to the Church that was arguably as important as liberating Jerusalem itself. They could convince themselves that they were still serving God's will, even as they pursued personal enrichment through the conquest of fellow Christians. The debate among the crusading leadership over whether to accept Prince Alexios' proposal revealed the complex mixture of motivations that had always characterized crusading expeditions. Some genuinely believed that reuniting the Christian churches was a sacred duty that justified temporary diversion from their original objectives. Others were frankly attracted by the wealth and opportunities that success would bring. A few expressed concerns about the morality of attacking Constantinople, but these voices were overwhelmed by the practical advantages that the prince's offer seemed to provide. Pope Innocent III's reaction to news of the proposed diversion was swift and unequivocal. He explicitly forbade any attack on the Byzantine Empire, pointing out that the Byzantines were Christians who posed no threat to the Holy Land, and that the Crusaders' vows bound them to fight only against the enemies of Christianity. The Pope's letters to the expedition's leaders were filled with threats of excommunication for anyone who participated in such an enterprise, along with appeals to honor the sacred oaths they had sworn when they took the cross. But papal authority, which had seemed so powerful when the crusade was being organized in Western Europe, proved to have limited influence over an expedition that was thousands of miles from Rome and facing immediate practical necessities. The crusading leaders had already demonstrated their willingness to defy papal commands during the siege of Zara, and they found it easier to rationalize their decision to support Prince Alexios by emphasizing the religious benefits that would supposedly result from reuniting the churches. The agreement reached between Prince Alexios and the crusading leadership in the spring of 1203 was formalized in a treaty that bound both parties to specific commitments while leaving crucial details deliberately vague. The Crusaders would transport Alexios to Constantinople and assist him in claiming his throne, while he would provide the financial and military support necessary for their subsequent expedition to the Holy Land. The terms seemed clear enough, but they concealed fundamental misunderstandings about Byzantine politics and the practical difficulties of fulfilling such ambitious promises. Prince Alexios, despite his imperial birth and education, had spent his formative years either in prison or in exile, leaving him with limited understanding of the actual state of the Byzantine Empire he hoped to rule. His promises of vast financial assistance were based on outdated assumptions about imperial wealth and his potential subjects' willingness to support heavy taxation for the benefit of Western expeditions. More dangerously, his guarantee of church reunion reflected a profound misunderstanding of the theological and cultural differences that had created the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. Similarly, the crusading leaders had little comprehension of the complex political situation they were entering in Constantinople. Their knowledge of Byzantine affairs was largely limited to the information provided by Prince Alexios himself, whose perspective was inevitably colored by his personal grievances and ambitions. They assumed that the young prince's claims to legitimacy would be widely accepted by the Byzantine population, and that his restoration would be welcomed by subjects who had supposedly suffered under his uncle's usurpation. The expedition that departed from Zara in April 1203 was thus based on a series of mutual misunderstandings and overly optimistic assumptions about what could be achieved through military force in the complex world of Eastern politics. The Crusaders believed they were undertaking a brief diversion that would solve their financial problems while serving the cause of Christian unity. Prince Alexios believed he was hiring a powerful army that would restore him to his rightful throne and enable him to pursue his family's traditional policies. Neither side fully understood the forces they were unleashing or the ultimate consequences of their partnership. The fleet that sailed from Zara toward Constantinople was one of the most impressive naval expeditions of the medieval period, consisting of approximately 200 vessels carrying nearly 20,000 men, along with their horses, equipment, and supplies. Venetian expertise in maritime logistics had made possible a military operation of unprecedented scope and complexity, while the combined resources of the crusading army and the Venetian state had created a force capable of challenging even the mighty Byzantine Empire. But the expedition's ultimate objectives remained unclear even to its own leaders. Some genuinely believed they were undertaking a brief intervention that would quickly restore legitimate imperial authority before proceeding to their original crusading mission. Others were already beginning to understand that the wealth and opportunities available in the Eastern Empire might prove more attractive than the uncertain prospects of campaigning in the Holy Land. Most significantly, some were beginning to realize that their financial commitments to Venice and their military commitments to Prince Alexios might prove incompatible with their religious obligations as crusaders. The voyage across the Adriatic and through the Greek islands provided time for reflection and planning, but it also revealed the fundamental contradictions in the expedition's multiple objectives. As the fleet approached the Dardanelles and prepared to enter the waters leading to Constantinople, the crusading leaders found themselves committed to a course of action whose ultimate consequences none of them could predict or control. The city that lay ahead of them was not merely the capital of the Byzantine Empire, but the largest, richest, and most magnificent urban center in the Christian world. Constantinople, in 1203, contained perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, making it larger than Paris, London, and Rome combined. Its harbors were filled with merchant ships from across the known world. Its palaces contained treasures accumulated over 8 centuries of imperial rule, and its churches housed religious artifacts and artistic masterpieces that represented the greatest achievements of Christian civilization. More importantly, Constantinople was protected by military fortifications that had never been breached by foreign enemies. The great sea chain that closed the Golden Horn, the massive land walls that had protected the city since the 5th century, and the strategic position that made siege warfare extremely difficult, had preserved Byzantine independence through centuries of attacks by Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and numerous other enemies. The city that the Crusaders approached had earned its reputation as the most impregnable fortress in the world. Yet the expedition that sailed toward Constantinople carried with it not only military power, but also the seeds of its own moral destruction. The decisions made during the winter at Zara had demonstrated that crusading vows could be subordinated to practical necessities, while the agreement with Prince Alexios had shown that religious expeditions could be diverted to serve political ambitions. The stage was set for betrayals that would shock the medieval world and permanently alter the balance of power between Eastern and Western Christianity. As the crusading fleet approached the entrance to the Bosphorus in late June 1203, the leaders of the expedition were still telling themselves that they were serving God's will by restoring legitimate imperial authority and reuniting the Christian churches. Within a year, they would be standing amid the smoking ruins of the greatest Christian city in the world, their hands stained with the blood of fellow believers, and their ships loaded with stolen treasures. The transformation of the Fourth Crusade from a holy war into a commercial enterprise was about to reach its logical and catastrophic conclusion. The morning mist was lifting from the waters of the Bosphorus when the crusading fleet first came within sight of Constantinople's legendary walls. Even the most traveled members of the expedition, veterans of campaigns across Europe and the Mediterranean, fell silent as they gazed upon the greatest city in the Christian world. The massive land walls stretched for miles along the western edge of the city, their triple tiers of fortifications rising like stone mountains from the earth. Above them soared the dome of Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, its golden cross catching the early morning light and seeming to bless the city that called itself the New Rome. But for all its magnificent appearance, Constantinople in 1203 was a city in crisis. Emperor Alexios III, the usurper who had blinded and imprisoned his brother Isaac II 8 years earlier, ruled over an empire that was financially exhausted, militarily weakened, and politically unstable. Years of civil wars, costly military campaigns, and administrative corruption had drained the imperial treasury, while the traditional theme system that had once provided reliable military recruitment had largely collapsed under the pressure of economic and social changes. The emperor's response to news of the approaching Crusader fleet revealed both the weakness of his position and the fundamental misunderstanding that characterized Byzantine perceptions of Western intentions. Alexios III had received reports of the expedition's progress for months, but he had assumed that any Western intervention would be limited to supporting his nephew's claims through diplomatic pressure rather than direct military action. The sight of nearly 200 ships filled with armed men approaching his capital forced him to confront the reality that he faced not a political challenge, but an existential threat to his rule. The initial confrontation between the crusading fleet and Byzantine defences came at the great chain that protected the entrance to the Golden Horn, Constantinople's magnificent natural harbour. This massive iron chain, supported by wooden floats and anchored to towers on both sides of the harbour mouth, had been the city's first line of defence for centuries. No enemy fleet had ever succeeded in forcing the chain, and its presence had always been sufficient to deter naval attacks on the imperial capital. But the Crusaders approached the problem with innovative tactics that reflected both Venetian maritime expertise and Western military technology. Instead of attempting to break the chain directly, they launched a coordinated assault on the defensive towers that anchored it, using ship-mounted siege engines and assault troops to overwhelm the Byzantine garrisons. The operation was a masterpiece of amphibious warfare that demonstrated the technological and tactical advantages that Western forces enjoyed over their Eastern opponents. The successful forcing of the Golden Horn chain sent shockwaves throughout Constantinople, not merely because it represented a military defeat, but because it symbolized the failure of defenses that had been considered impregnable for centuries. Citizens who had grown up believing that their city was divinely protected began to question whether God was still watching over the empire that called itself the defender of Orthodox Christianity. Emperor Alexios III's response to this crisis revealed both personal cowardice and political incompetence that would ultimately prove fatal to his regime. Instead of rallying his subjects for a determined defense of their capital, he began secret negotiations aimed at preserving his personal position through some form of accommodation with the invaders. These negotiations were conducted through intermediaries and focused primarily on finding face-saving formulas that might allow him to retain his throne while making some form of symbolic submission to his nephew's claims. But the emperor's willingness to negotiate from a position of weakness only encouraged the Crusaders to increase their demands and demonstrated to his subjects that their ruler was more concerned with personal survival than with defending the empire. The political authority that Byzantine emperors derived from their role as God's representatives on earth required them to project an image of strength and divine favor. By appearing weak and indecisive in the face of foreign invasion, Alexios III was undermining the religious and cultural foundations of his own legitimacy. The siege operations that followed the forcing of the Golden Horn revealed the technological superiority that gave Western forces significant advantages over their Byzantine opponents. Crusader siege engines, developed through generations of warfare in the stone-walled cities of Western Europe, were more advanced and more effective than anything in the Byzantine arsenal. More importantly, Western tactics emphasized aggressive assault and concentrated firepower, while Byzantine military doctrine still relied on defensive strategies that had been effective against earlier enemies, but were inadequate against the new form of warfare practiced by the Crusaders. The decisive engagement came on July 17, 1203, when Crusader forces launched a coordinated assault against the sea wall that protected Constantinople's harbour frontage. This section of the city's fortifications was considered the weakest link in the defensive system, but it had never been seriously tested because previous enemies had lacked the naval capabilities necessary to mount effective attacks from the water. The Crusaders, supported by Venetian galleys and specialized assault vessels, were able to concentrate overwhelming force against a relatively short section of wall, while preventing Byzantine defenders from reinforcing the threatened area. The assault was successful beyond the Crusaders' most optimistic expectations. Western knights, fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew that failure meant death or captivity, succeeded in establishing footholds on the wall that they gradually expanded into secure bridgeheads. Byzantine resistance, while fierce in individual cases, lacked the coordination and leadership necessary to mount effective counterattacks. Most critically, Emperor Alexios III failed to appear personally at the critical points of the fighting, leaving his subordinates to organize the defense without the imperial presence that Byzantine military tradition considered essential for success. The psychological impact of the successful assault was even more devastating than its immediate military consequences. Constantinople had not been breached by foreign enemies since its founding over 8 centuries earlier, and the sight of Western banners flying from the city's walls shattered Byzantine confidence in their divine protection and imperial destiny. Citizens who had lived their entire lives believing that their city was unconquerable began fleeing toward the Asiatic suburbs, while others prepared for the siege's end by hiding their valuables and making arrangements to protect their families from the rapine that traditionally followed the capture of a city by assault. Emperor Alexios III's reaction to the breach of his capital's defenses was immediate flight rather than continued resistance. On the night of July 17th to 18th, 1203, he loaded the imperial treasury onto ships and escaped across the Bosphorus to the Asiatic territories of the empire, abandoning his capital, his subjects, and his throne in order to preserve his personal safety. His flight was so precipitate that he left behind not only the bulk of the imperial wealth, but also his own family members, including his daughter, who was married to Prince Alexios. The emperor's abandonment of Constantinople created a political vacuum that the city's remaining leaders filled by releasing the blinded Isaac II from prison and restoring him to nominal imperial authority. This decision was motivated by desperate hope that recognizing the father of the Crusaders' protégé might prevent the sack of the city while providing a constitutional framework for negotiating the restoration of young Alexios IV to his claimed inheritance. But Isaac II, after years of imprisonment and blindness, was both physically and mentally incapable of providing effective leadership during the crisis that faced the empire. The restoration of Isaac II and the coronation of his son Alexios IV as co-emperor in August 1203 was hailed by the crusading leadership as a complete vindication of their intervention in Byzantine affairs. They had successfully restored the legitimate imperial dynasty while avoiding the complete conquest of Constantinople that would have required them to take direct responsibility for governing the empire. Most importantly, they now had access to the vast financial resources that Prince Alexios had promised them, enabling them to pay their debts to Venice and proceed with their original mission to the Holy Land. But the apparent success of the Crusaders' intervention concealed fundamental problems that would soon prove fatal to their partnership with the restored imperial dynasty. Emperor Alexios IV, despite his promises of vast financial assistance, discovered that the imperial treasury had been largely emptied by his uncle's flight, and that the Byzantine economy was in no condition to support the kind of massive payments he had committed to provide. The empire's traditional sources of revenue had been disrupted by years of civil war and administrative breakdown, while the expenses of maintaining the government and defending the remaining imperial territories continued to consume whatever resources could be collected. More significantly, the new emperor's dependence on Western military support made him deeply unpopular with his subjects, who viewed his restoration as a betrayal of Byzantine independence and orthodox religious traditions. The presence of thousands of armed Westerners in the vicinity of the capital created daily incidents and conflicts that inflamed popular hostility toward both the occupying forces and the imperial government that had invited them. Citizens who had initially welcomed Isaac II's restoration as a liberation from his brother's tyranny soon began to see the new regime as a puppet government serving foreign interests rather than Byzantine welfare. The religious dimension of the crisis was equally problematic for the long-term stability of the arrangement. Prince Alexios' promises to heal the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity by bringing the Byzantine Church under papal authority proved to be based on fundamental misunderstandings of both theology and ecclesiastical politics. The Orthodox clergy and most of the Byzantine population regarded papal supremacy as heretical, while submission to Rome was seen as apostasy that would cost them their salvation. Alexios IV's attempts to implement church reunion triggered massive popular protests and clerical resistance that further undermined his political position. The winter of 1203 to 1204 was thus a period of growing tension and mutual mistrust between the Crusaders and their Byzantine allies. Alexios IV found himself caught between his obligations to his Western supporters and his subjects' demands that he expel the foreign occupiers and restore traditional imperial independence. The Crusaders, meanwhile, became increasingly impatient with their failure to receive the financial assistance they had been promised, while the hostile attitude of the Byzantine population made it clear that their presence was creating more problems than it was solving. The crisis came to a head in January 1204, when popular riots in Constantinople led to the overthrow of Alexios IV and Isaac II and their replacement by Alexios V Ducas, a court official who had gained power by promising to expel the Western occupiers and restore Byzantine independence. The new emperor immediately repudiated all agreements with the Crusaders and began organizing the city's defenses for what now appeared to be an inevitable siege. The brief period of cooperation between East and West was over, and both sides began preparing for a conflict that would determine the future of the Byzantine Empire. The transformation of the Fourth Crusade from a restoration mission into a war of conquest was now complete. The Crusaders, who had initially presented themselves as protectors of legitimate imperial authority, found themselves cast in the role of foreign invaders, seeking to impose their will on a Christian empire through military force. The moral contradictions inherent in their position were becoming impossible to ignore, but their financial obligations to Venice and their military commitments to each other made retreat impossible. The stage was set for the final act of the Fourth Crusade's betrayal of its original mission, a catastrophe that would cripple the Byzantine Empire and permanently alter the balance of power between Eastern and Western Christianity. The dawn of April 12th, 1204, broke grey and cold over Constantinople as the final Crusader assault began. For 9 months, the greatest city in the Christian world had been under siege by men who claimed to serve the Prince of Peace, but who had transformed their holy mission into a quest for worldly treasure. Now, as scaling ladders scraped against the ancient walls and siege towers rolled forward through the morning mist, the moment of ultimate betrayal had arrived. Emperor Alexios V Ducas stood on the land wall watching the Western host deploy for their final attack. Behind him stretched the greatest metropolis in the medieval world, a city of 500,000 souls, countless churches, palaces that housed the accumulated wealth of centuries, and libraries containing the preserved wisdom of antiquity. Before him advanced an army of perhaps 20,000 crusaders, their banners bearing the cross of Christ, while their hearts burned with desire for the riches that lay beyond the walls. The emperor had done everything possible to prepare his city for this moment. The great chain across the Golden Horn had been repaired and reinforced. The walls had been strengthened with additional towers and artillery positions. Most importantly, The citizens of Constantinople had been organized into militia units that would support the regular garrison in defending their homes and families. Yet Alexios V knew that his forces were outnumbered and that Western siege techniques had already proven their effectiveness during the previous year's assault. The attack began at dawn, with a coordinated assault along multiple sections of the wall, designed to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces at any single point. Venetian galleys attacked the seawall from the harbour, while Crusader siege engines battered the land wall with stones and incendiary projectiles. The air filled with the screams of wounded men, the crash of catapult stones against masonry, and the prayers of defenders who understood that they were fighting not just for their city, but for their civilization. But it was the innovation of the flying bridge that ultimately decided the battle's outcome. Venetian engineers had constructed a massive siege tower, topped with a drawbridge that could be lowered onto the wall, allowing assault troops to cross directly from their siege equipment onto the battlements. When this device succeeded in establishing a foothold on the wall, Western knights poured across the bridge, while Byzantine defenders found themselves fighting desperately to prevent the expansion of the bridgehead. The decisive moment came when a small group of Crusaders succeeded in opening one of the gates from the inside, allowing their comrades to pour into the city in overwhelming numbers. Byzantine resistance, which had been fierce and well coordinated during the assault on the walls, collapsed rapidly once Western forces gained access to the city's interior. Emperor Alexios V, seeing that the battle was lost, fled the capital as his predecessor had done, leaving his subjects to face the consequences of defeat without imperial leadership. What followed was 3 days of systematic destruction that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to the brutalities of siege warfare. The sack of Constantinople was not the uncontrolled rampage of victorious soldiers drunk on success, but a carefully organized looting operation designed to extract maximum wealth from the fallen city while demonstrating Western power over the defeated Byzantines. The Crusaders had transformed from holy warriors into professional thieves operating on an unprecedented scale. The crusading leadership had established detailed procedures for dividing the spoils of victory even before the final assault began. All treasure was to be collected at central locations and distributed according to predetermined shares, with Venice receiving 1/4, the crusading nobles another quarter, and the remaining half divided among the common soldiers and clergy. This systematic approach to plunder ensured that the looting proceeded with military efficiency while preventing conflicts among the conquerors over the division of their gains. The wealth that the Crusaders discovered in Constantinople exceeded their wildest expectations. The imperial palace alone contained treasures accumulated over 8 centuries of successful rule, including silk hangings worth more than the annual revenues of entire kingdoms, jewellery crafted from precious stones gathered from across the known world, and ceremonial objects whose artistic value was incalculable. The churches of the city housed religious artifacts of enormous spiritual significance to Eastern Christianity, many of which were melted down for their gold and silver content, without regard for their sacred character. But the systematic destruction of Constantinople's cultural heritage was perhaps even more catastrophic than the theft of its material wealth. The Imperial Library, which contained the largest collection of classical manuscripts in the world, was scattered and burned by soldiers who saw no value in preserving the intellectual legacy of antiquity. Artistic masterpieces that had survived since the time of Justinian were destroyed by men seeking to extract precious metals from religious objects. Centuries of accumulated wisdom and beauty vanished in 3 days of methodical vandalism. The treatment of Constantinople's civilian population during the sack revealed the complete moral collapse of an expedition that had begun with sacred vows to protect Christians and liberate the Holy Land. Women and children were subjected to systematic sexual violence, while elderly citizens were tortured to reveal the locations of hidden wealth. Priests and monks were murdered in their own churches, often while attempting to protect sacred objects from desecration. The Crusaders, who had sworn to serve the Prince of Peace, had become indistinguishable from the pagan raiders who had once threatened Christian civilization. Perhaps most shocking was the deliberate destruction of religious sites that had been venerated by Christians for centuries. Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Eastern Christian world, was stripped of its sacred furnishings, while prostitutes were placed on the patriarchal throne in mockery of orthodox religious traditions. Other churches were converted into stables for crusader horses, while religious icons were smashed or burned as examples of Eastern idolatry. The men who claimed to be defending Christianity were systematically destroying some of its most sacred sites. The desecration of Hagia Sophia became symbolic of the entire Fourth Crusade's betrayal of its religious mission. This magnificent church, built by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, had been the spiritual center of Eastern Christianity for over 6 centuries. Its soaring dome and elaborate mosaics represented the highest achievements of Byzantine art and architecture, while its religious significance to Orthodox Christians was comparable to that of St. Peter's Basilica for Catholics. To see it defiled by Western soldiers who claimed to serve the same God was a trauma from which Eastern Christianity would never fully recover. The political consequences of Constantinople's fall were equally devastating for the Byzantine Empire and the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, electing Count Baldwin of Flanders as emperor and dividing Byzantine territories among themselves, according to a predetermined partition treaty. This new state was essentially a colonial regime designed to extract wealth from conquered territories rather than a legitimate government serving the interests of its subjects. The partition of the Byzantine Empire among the crusading nobles created a patchwork of Western principalities that had no historical legitimacy or cultural connection to the territories they claimed to rule. Greek-speaking populations found themselves governed by foreign lords who neither understood their language nor respected their religious traditions. The efficient administrative system that had governed the Eastern Empire for centuries was replaced by a feudal structure that prioritized the enrichment of Western colonizers over the welfare of Byzantine subjects. Venice emerged as the greatest beneficiary of the Fourth Crusade's success, gaining control over a network of strategic ports and islands that would dominate Eastern Mediterranean trade for centuries to come. Doge Dandolo's vision of Venetian commercial empire had been realized beyond his most ambitious dreams. While the Republic's rivals found themselves excluded from the lucrative markets that had previously been open to all Italian merchants, the Fourth Crusade had succeeded brilliantly as a Venetian commercial venture, even as it failed catastrophically as a religious expedition. The establishment of the Latin Empire also had profound consequences for the broader struggle between Christianity and Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean. The destruction of Byzantine military power removed the principal Christian barrier to Muslim expansion in Anatolia and the Balkans, while the crusading resources that should have been devoted to defending the Holy Land were instead consumed in maintaining Western control over conquered Byzantine territories. The Fourth Crusade had weakened Christianity's overall position in its confrontation with Islam, while claiming to strengthen it. The reaction throughout the Christian world to news of Constantinople's sack was one of horror and condemnation. Pope Innocent III, despite his initial pleasure at the apparent reunion of the churches under papal authority, was shocked by reports of the systematic destruction and sacrilege that had accompanied the city's capture. His letters to the crusading leadership expressed outrage at the violation of their religious vows and demanded explanations for atrocities that had dishonored the cross they claimed to serve. But papal condemnation had little practical effect on a fait accompli that had already redistributed power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusaders, who had enriched themselves through the sack of Constantinople, were not inclined to return their gains in response to clerical criticism. While the Venetians had achieved commercial advantages, that they intended to maintain regardless of religious objections. The moral authority of the Church, which had been the driving force behind the crusading movement, had been permanently compromised by the Fourth Crusade's betrayal of its spiritual mission. The long-term consequences of the Fourth Crusade extended far beyond the immediate destruction of the Byzantine Empire. The deep mistrust between Eastern and Western Christianity that resulted from the sack of Constantinople would poison relations between the Orthodox and Catholic churches for centuries, making genuine cooperation against common enemies increasingly difficult. When Ottoman Turkish armies later threatened the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, Western Europe's response was limited by memories of Crusader betrayal and Orthodox reluctance to seek help from those who had once been their destroyers. More broadly, the Fourth Crusade demonstrated the fundamental contradictions inherent in attempting to serve both God and Mammon through military action. The expedition that had begun with genuine religious enthusiasm had been gradually corrupted by financial necessity, political ambition, and simple greed until its sacred mission became indistinguishable from organized robbery. The transformation was so complete that participants could engage in systematic destruction of Christian sites while convincing themselves that they were serving God's will. The Fourth Crusade also revealed the power of commercial interests to shape and ultimately subvert political and religious movements. Venetian influence over the expedition's direction had been decisive at every crucial juncture, from the initial agreement to transport the crusading army to the final decision to partition the Byzantine Empire. The Republic's merchants and politicians had succeeded in using religious enthusiasm to advance their commercial goals while bearing none of the moral responsibility for the expedition's crimes. As the smoke cleared over the ruined palaces and churches of Constantinople in the spring of 1204, the participants in the Fourth Crusade began to understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished and destroyed. They had succeeded in capturing the greatest prize in the medieval world, enriching themselves beyond their wildest dreams while expanding Western power deep into the Eastern Mediterranean. But they had also committed what many historians consider the greatest betrayal in medieval history, destroying a Christian empire that had preserved classical learning and orthodox traditions for over 8 centuries. The Latin Empire that they established would survive for only 57 years before being reconquered by Byzantine forces. But the damage they inflicted on Eastern Christianity would prove irreversible. Most problematic for the long-term survival of these Crusader states was their complete dependence on continued military and financial support from Western Europe. Unlike the original Crusader states in the Holy Land, which had been established in territories where indigenous Christian populations welcomed liberation from Muslim rule, the Latin states in former Byzantine territories governed Orthodox populations that viewed Western rule as religious and cultural oppression. The religious dimension of Latin rule created particularly severe problems for the stability of the conquered territories. The Crusader lords' attempts to impose Latin religious practices on Orthodox populations triggered widespread resistance that went far beyond simple political opposition. The Orthodox clergy, who had served as community leaders under Byzantine rule, became the focal points of resistance movements that combined religious revival with political rebellion against foreign occupation. The Latin clergy, installed in conquered territories, proved equally problematic for the establishment of stable governance. Many were poorly educated men who had joined the Crusades seeking worldly advancement rather than spiritual fulfillment, and they showed little interest in understanding or respecting the religious traditions of their Orthodox subjects. Their attempts to suppress Orthodox practices and impose Latin liturgical forms created deep resentment that undermined any possibility of achieving genuine religious unity between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pope Innocent III's initial enthusiasm for the apparent reunification of the churches under papal authority gradually gave way to dismay as reports reached Rome of the systematic oppression of Orthodox Christians by their Latin rulers. The Pope's letters from this period reveal growing awareness that the Fourth Crusade had created division rather than unity within Christianity, while strengthening Islam's position by eliminating the Byzantine Empire as an effective defender of Christian territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. The economic consequences of the Latin conquest were equally devastating for the territories involved. The sophisticated commercial and administrative systems that had sustained Byzantine prosperity for centuries were disrupted by rulers who understood neither their complexity nor their importance. Trade routes that had connected Europe, Asia, and Africa through Constantinople were disrupted, while agricultural production declined under the pressure of constant warfare and heavy taxation imposed to fund Western garrisons. The cultural destruction that accompanied the political conquest was perhaps even more tragic than the economic disruption. The libraries, schools, and artistic workshops that had preserved and developed the intellectual heritage of both classical antiquity and Christian civilization were abandoned or destroyed by conquerors who valued only material wealth. Manuscripts that had survived since the time of Justinian were lost forever, while artistic traditions that had flourished under Byzantine patronage withered under rulers who showed no interest in cultural achievements. The most successful resistance to Latin rule came from Greek nobles who had escaped the initial conquest and established independent states in territories beyond Western control. The Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore Lascaris in Western Anatolia, maintained the Byzantine imperial tradition while building military and diplomatic capabilities that would eventually enable the reconquest of Constantinople. The despotate of Epirus and the Empire of Trebizond provided additional centers of Greek resistance that kept alive the hope of Byzantine restoration. These Greek successor states benefited enormously from the loyalty of Orthodox populations, who preferred even distant Greek rule to immediate Latin occupation. The Nicaean emperors, in particular, succeeded in presenting themselves as the legitimate heirs of the Byzantine imperial tradition, while their Latin rivals were increasingly seen as foreign usurpers, whose authority rested solely on military force. This contrast in legitimacy would ultimately prove decisive in determining the long-term outcome of the struggle for control over former Byzantine territories. The Nicene court also became a refuge for the intellectual and cultural traditions that were being suppressed in Latin-occupied territories. Scholars, artists, and clergy who had fled Constantinople gathered in Nicaea, where they preserved and developed the theological, philosophical, and literary traditions that had made Byzantine civilization great. This cultural renaissance in exile would later provide the foundation for the Byzantine Empire's eventual restoration and renewal. The military weakness of the Latin Empire became increasingly apparent as resistance movements gained strength and coordination throughout the occupied territories. The empire's armies, never large enough to control effectively the vast territories they claimed, were gradually worn down by constant campaigns against enemies who enjoyed popular support and knowledge of local terrain. Western reinforcements from Europe were limited by the expense and difficulty of transportation, while local recruitment was impossible among populations that viewed Latin rule as illegitimate. The decisive turning point came in 1261, when Michael VIII, Palaiologos, Emperor of Nicaea, succeeded in recapturing Constantinople through a combination of military force and political subversion. The Latin garrison that had held the city for 57 years collapsed with surprising rapidity when faced with a coordinated assault by forces representing the legitimate Byzantine imperial tradition. Emperor Baldwin II fled the city as his predecessors had done, carrying with him the crown jewels and whatever portable wealth he could gather, but leaving behind the ruined remains of the Latin Empire. The restoration of Byzantine rule to Constantinople was celebrated throughout the Orthodox world as divine vindication of the empire's claims to legitimacy and permanence. Emperor Michael VIII entered the city in triumph, formally crowned in Hagia Sophia, according to traditional Orthodox ceremonies that emphasized the sacred character of imperial authority. The Latin Empire, which had claimed to represent Christian unity and papal supremacy, had proved to be an artificial creation that could not survive the test of popular resistance and external pressure. But the Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Latin occupation was profoundly weakened by 57 years of foreign rule and territorial fragmentation. The economic prosperity that had sustained the empire for centuries had been shattered, while the population had been reduced by warfare, emigration, and economic disruption. Most critically, the empire's strategic position had been permanently compromised by the rise of new powers that had filled the vacuum created by Byzantine collapse. The most dangerous of these new powers was the Ottoman Emirate, which had emerged in northwestern Anatolia during the period of Latin rule and was now expanding rapidly at the expense of both Byzantine and Turkish neighbours. The Ottomans combined military effectiveness with sophisticated administrative and religious institutions that enabled them to integrate conquered populations while building a powerful state that would eventually threaten all of Europe. The Fourth Crusade, which had claimed to strengthen Christianity against Islamic expansion, had instead created conditions that enabled the rise of the most dangerous Muslim power in European history. The restored Byzantine Empire would survive for nearly 2 more centuries, but it would never recover the power and prosperity it had enjoyed before the Fourth Crusade. The Latin conquest had permanently altered the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, while the trauma of Western betrayal had created deep mistrust between Eastern and Western Christianity that would prevent effective cooperation against common enemies. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade was not Christian unity, but Christian division, not religious triumph, but spiritual catastrophe. The emperor who rode through the gates of Constantinople on August 15th, 1261, carried with him the hopes and dreams of every Orthodox Christian who had prayed for the restoration of the rightful imperial dynasty. Michael VIII, Paleologos, had accomplished what many believed impossible: the liberation of the Queen of Cities from Latin occupation and the restoration of the Byzantine Empire to its ancestral capital. But as he made his way through streets still scarred by the devastation of 1204, the emperor understood that he was inheriting not the glorious empire of Justinian or Basil II, but the broken remnant of a civilization that had been mortally wounded by Western betrayal. The task facing the restored empire was overwhelming in its complexity and scope. 57 years of Latin rule had not merely weakened Byzantine institutions, it had fundamentally altered the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that could never be completely reversed. The sophisticated administrative system that had once governed territories from the Danube to the Euphrates had been replaced by a patchwork of Western feudal arrangements that served the interests of foreign lords other than imperial unity. More devastating still was the demographic catastrophe that had befallen the empire during the Latin period. Constantinople itself, which had housed perhaps 400,000 inhabitants at the time of the Fourth Crusade, now contained fewer than 100,000 residents. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, their marble palaces and golden churches reduced to rubble by 50 years of neglect and deliberate destruction. The great harbour that had once welcomed merchant ships from across the known world now sheltered only fishing boats and the occasional Genoese trader. The economic foundations of Byzantine prosperity had been equally shattered by the Latin conquest and its aftermath. The trade networks that had made Constantinople the commercial centre of the medieval world had been disrupted and redirected through Italian cities, while the agricultural regions that had sustained the empire's population were devastated by constant warfare between competing claimants to imperial authority. The tax revenues that had once funded magnificent building projects and powerful armies were now barely sufficient to maintain basic governmental functions. Emperor Michael VIII's response to these challenges demonstrated both the resilience of Byzantine political traditions and the fundamental limitations that constrained the restored empire's recovery. Drawing on diplomatic skills honed during decades of exile and resistance, he negotiated a series of agreements with Western powers that secured recognition of the restored empire, while avoiding the complete subordination that his predecessors had been forced to accept. The Treaty of Nymphaeum with Genoa, in particular, provided crucial naval support against Venetian attempts to restore Latin rule, while grants of trading privileges offered the promise of renewed commercial prosperity. But these diplomatic successes came at enormous cost to Byzantine independence and Orthodox religious traditions. Michael's agreement to pursue reunification of the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority was deeply unpopular with his subjects, who viewed submission to Rome as apostasy and betrayal of the Orthodox faith for which they had suffered under Latin occupation. The emperor's attempts to implement church union triggered widespread popular resistance and clerical opposition that weakened his domestic position while failing to achieve the Western military support that such submission was supposed to secure. The religious crisis created by Michael VIII's unionist policies had profound consequences for the restored empire's political stability and cultural identity. The Orthodox Church, which had served as the primary institution preserving Byzantine traditions during the Latin period, found itself in opposition to an imperial government that seemed willing to sacrifice Orthodox principles for political advantage. This conflict between church and state undermined the religious legitimacy that had traditionally sustained imperial authority, while creating divisions within Byzantine society that enemies could exploit. More immediately threatening was the military situation that confronted the restored empire on multiple frontiers. In Anatolia, Turkish emirates that had expanded their territories during the period of Byzantine weakness were pressing against the empire's remaining Asian possessions, while in the Balkans, Bulgarian and Serbian kingdoms pursued their own imperial ambitions at Byzantine expense. Most ominously, a new Turkish power was emerging in northwestern Anatolia under the leadership of Osman Bey, founder of what would become the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans represented a fundamentally different type of threat than any the Byzantine Empire had faced in its long history. Unlike previous enemies who had been either nomadic raiders seeking loot and tribute, or established states pursuing limited territorial objectives, the Ottomans were building a comprehensive Islamic empire designed to replace Byzantine authority entirely. Their combination of military effectiveness, administrative sophistication, and religious appeal to Muslim populations made them far more dangerous than the fragmented Turkish emirates that had previously threatened Byzantine territories. The empire's military response to these multiple threats was constrained by the financial and demographic weaknesses that were the legacy of the Fourth Crusade. The theme system that had once provided reliable military recruitment had collapsed during the Latin period, while the empire's reduced territorial base made it impossible to support the large armies that had once made Byzantine power respected throughout the known world. Professional soldiers were expensive and foreign mercenaries were unreliable, leaving the empire dependent on military allies whose support came with political strings attached. Emperor Michael VIII's death in 1282 marked the end of the last serious attempt to restore the Byzantine Empire to its former greatness. His son and successor, Andronikos II, inherited an empire that was financially exhausted by constant warfare and diplomatically isolated by the religious controversies that had characterized his father's reign. The new emperor's abandonment of the unpopular church union policy restored domestic tranquility, but eliminated any prospect of Western military assistance against the growing Ottoman threat. The civil wars that plagued the empire during the 14th century completed the destruction that the Fourth Crusade had begun. The conflict between Andronikos II and his grandson Andronikos III, 1321 to 1328, was followed by an even more devastating struggle between John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakouzenos, 1341 to 1347. that reduced the empire to a collection of isolated cities surrounded by enemy territory. These internal conflicts provided opportunities for the Ottomans to establish themselves in Europe, while the empire's remaining resources were consumed in fratricidal warfare rather than defense against external enemies. The social and economic consequences of these civil wars were catastrophic for the empire's remaining population. Agricultural production collapsed as armies repeatedly ravaged the countryside, while trade and manufacturing were disrupted by constant warfare and political instability. The great families that had traditionally provided leadership for the empire were decimated by political purges and military defeats, while the common people fled to territories under foreign control that offered greater security than their native empire could provide. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than Constantinople itself, plus a few scattered territories in the Peloponnese and the islands. The once mighty empire that had ruled from the Danube to the Euphrates now controlled less territory than many Western duchies, while its emperors were reduced to the status of Ottoman vassals who ruled at the Sultan's pleasure. The transformation was so complete that foreign observers questioned whether the empire could still be considered a meaningful political entity. Yet, even in its final century, the Byzantine Empire continued to serve important symbolic and cultural functions that transcended its diminished political power. Constantinople remained the center of Orthodox Christianity, while the imperial court preserved intellectual and artistic traditions that connected the medieval world to the classical heritage of antiquity. The empire's scholars and theologians continued to produce works of lasting importance, while its artists created masterpieces that influenced cultural development throughout Eastern Europe. The empire's diplomatic activities during this final period also demonstrated the continued vitality of Byzantine political traditions despite territorial weakness. Emperors John VIII and Constantine XI conducted sophisticated negotiations with Western powers, offering church reunion in exchange for military assistance against the Ottoman threat. These efforts ultimately failed to secure effective support, but they revealed both the empire's understanding of international politics and the West's continued unwillingness to provide adequate assistance to the Eastern Empire that the Fourth Crusade had betrayed. The final siege of Constantinople in 1453 was both the logical conclusion of processes set in motion by the Fourth Crusade and a tragedy that shocked the medieval world. Sultan Mehmed II's conquest of the city was achieved through military innovations and massive resource mobilization that made Byzantine resistance hopeless. But the empire's weakness was fundamentally the result of damage inflicted 250 years earlier by Western Crusaders, who had claimed to serve the same god as their victims. Emperor Constantine XI's death on the walls of his capital, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, provided a fitting end to an empire that had never recovered from the betrayal of 1204. The last Byzantine emperor died as a soldier defending his city and his faith, while the Crusader emperors who had briefly ruled in Constantinople had fled at the first sign of serious resistance. The contrast could not have been more revealing of the moral and political differences between legitimate and illegitimate rule. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world, but the responses revealed how little the Fourth Crusade's betrayal had been forgotten or forgiven. While Western rulers expressed ritual regret at the loss of the last Christian empire in the East, their actual assistance to the defenders had been minimal and ineffective. The mutual mistrust created by the events of 1204 had made genuine cooperation impossible, leaving the Byzantines to face their final crisis alone. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople was more than just the end of the Byzantine Empire. It was the final consequence of the Fourth Crusade's devastating impact on Eastern Christianity. The empire that had preserved classical learning, Orthodox traditions, and Christian civilization in the East for over 1,000 years was destroyed not primarily by Muslim enemies, but by the long-term effects of Christian betrayal. The Fourth Crusade, had succeeded in weakening Christianity's position against Islam while claiming to strengthen it, in dividing Christians while claiming to unite them. The historical judgment on the Fourth Crusade must therefore acknowledge not only the immediate devastation it caused in 1204, but also its role in creating the conditions that made possible the eventual Ottoman conquest of the Eastern Christian world. The Crusaders who sacked Constantinople claimed to be serving God's will, but their actions ultimately served to expand Islamic power at Christianity's expense. Their betrayal of the Byzantine Empire was not just a moral catastrophe, but a strategic disaster whose consequences shaped the development of both Christianity and Islam for centuries to come. As you drift into peaceful sleep tonight, remember that the greatest betrayals in history are often committed by those who claim to serve the highest ideals. The Fourth Crusade reminds us that religious fervor, when corrupted by greed and political ambition, can become more destructive than honest atheism. The knights who destroyed Constantinople while carrying the cross of Christ teach us that sacred symbols mean nothing when divorced from sacred principles. Let the gentle crackling of our fire carry you into rest, where the only empires that matter are those built on justice rather than conquest, on service rather than exploitation, on the recognition that all human beings, regardless of their language, customs, or religious traditions, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The real tragedy of the Fourth Crusade was not just that it destroyed a great empire, but that it revealed how easily the noblest human aspirations can be perverted into instruments of oppression and destruction. Sweet dreams await those who understand that true faith is measured not by the destruction of enemies, but by the protection of the innocent, not by the accumulation of wealth, but by the service of others, not by the triumph of one tradition over another, but by the recognition that God's love extends to all humanity, regardless of the banners under which they march or the languages in which they pray.